Well, I'm so glad to be back, and we're starting a brand new series today. We're going to call it Overflow, but I've missed you all. The whole time that I was gone, I've missed you. I don't know what you do when you're on vacation, but what I do while I'm on vacation is read books, read just about everything that I can. And so while I was gone, I read tons of books, but I found a really interesting article, and this is kind of random to begin with, but I liked it because it talked about this thing called echoic memory. Have you ever heard of this? It's called echoic memory. And essentially the idea is, that you hear a sound, and when you hear that sound, your brain, without you even thinking about it, your brain recalls memories, right? That sound is actually attached to an experience or to something that you've heard before. So, for example, for all of my millennial and Gen Xer fans in the room, listen to this sound. Right, so I don't know about you, but where I was sitting in my bedroom, right? I was remembering sitting in my bedroom with my brother in our shag carpet, our blue shag carpet in our house, playing the Mario game. And he thought he was playing, but I had his controller unplugged, and so I remember that really, really well. It was a memory, right? And so without even thinking about it, maybe you heard that sound and you were just transported someplace in your mind. You remembered the first time you heard that sound. It's really cool that our brains do these things without us thinking about it. That subconsciously it just happens. You didn't have to actively do anything. It just recalled. Our brains are actually really fascinating. There's amazing things that they can do. One of the other things that our brains can do is they can tell us when something's not right. Right? And the connection between our ears and our minds, even with sound, right? They can tell us when something's just off and it's not quite right. And so I want to play a sound, and before I do, I want to say that I'm going to issue a kind of a competition, okay? So what I'm about to play for you is just a sound from a soundtrack of a movie. And what I'd like you to do, if you will be the first person in here that can correctly identify what this sound is and where it came from, I will send you a $25 Amazon gift card. Now let me give you a hint. I'll give you just a couple of hints. This came from what I think is one of the best movies ever. It's definitely the best superhero movie ever. And in the midst of this sound that you're going to hear is actually a part of a 9-minute song. I'm only going to play like 30 seconds of it, but it's a part of a 9-minute song that was written for a character in this movie. So if you know what this is, then you just be the first person to message me on social media or send me a text right now, and then I'll tell you what it is. Okay, so ready? Let's listen to this song. Now, isn't it weird, like you listen to that and you just can tell something's off, right? The fascinating thing, I think I've had plenty of time for you to message me or someone to reach out to me, so the answer with this is actually the Joker's theme from The Dark Knight. It's a Christopher Nolan Batman movie. I'm a huge Batman guy. Somebody asked me once if I fell asleep and woke up and realized I'd been turned into Superman, what would I do? And I said I would go back to sleep and hope to wake up as Batman the next day, right? That's just who I am. I'm a huge fan. And so this sound is actually, it's actually the part of the theme that Hans Zimmer, who's just a musical genius, created to help people understand that something was off with the main villain, the Joker, in the movie. And the cool thing is, it's one note, right? It's one note. But what he did was he kind of adjusted it. It makes you like your brain, what's going on, if you understand music theory, is your brain is actually like almost asking for the song to jump up a note, but you can't, like it never does. And so it creates this tension where you know something's not right, but you can't quite put your finger on it. You can't quite figure out what it is. Now, here's what's interesting, okay? Here's why I wanted to do this. This whole idea where our brains can pick up on something not being right actually happens in our spiritual lives, too. And it could be that like your life, there's a one-note song just kind of getting played out there, and it feels like consistent. It's the same pattern you've always been in. It's the same steps you've always taken, but something just feels off. And what's fascinating to me is culturally, like where we are right now, more and more and more people are waking up to the reality that something's just not right in our world. Something feels off. Something feels broken. And over the next few weeks, I want to talk about this through the lens of what we call authenticity. And we're going to talk about authenticity a lot, but the name of the series, what we're going with, is called Overflow. And the reason that we're calling it Overflow is because Jesus talked about this idea that what was inside of us eventually will come out, that what's in our hearts eventually flows out through our words, and what we're seeing is an outflow of something in our world that we just kind of feel like is off. Something just feels broken. Now, this series is all going to be recorded for you at tcat.church/overflow. So listen, if you miss a week or you're on vacation or something, you can go back and catch up. tcat.church/overflow. There'll be plenty of discussion questions and lots of stuff to get you into the conversation as we go. Now, I want to start with a question, all right? And it's a question that all of us wrestle with, whether you're a Jesus follower or not, whether you've been to church 100 times or not. This is a question you've asked yourself because we all ask it. What's the best way to live? What's the best way to live? Like, what kind of decisions should I be making? What should I be doing with my life? What direction should I orient myself? And as a Jesus follower, a long time ago, I made the decision that the one who knew how to answer this question better than I did was a man named Jesus of Nazareth. And so in my case, when you ask me the question, what's the best way to live? I say, well, as a follower of Jesus, I want to live in the direction that he has put my life, that I have put him as the centerpiece, right? That the mile marker, okay, like the standard, the guide that's out there for me is Jesus. And every time I need to make a decision, well, then I ask him what it is. And every time I need to compare a situation in my life to what I think I should do or shouldn't do, I look at what Jesus has to say, that's the best way for me to live my life. Now, fascinating enough, if you made that decision, you know that on a daily basis, you're probably confronted with decisions that you feel like Jesus would have you make. Remember the what would Jesus do bracelets we used to wear in the 90s, right? That Jesus would have you do this, but everybody else kind of seems to be doing this. Right? That something just kind of seems off, that like we know, God says this is what's best for me, but everybody else is doing this. And we think this is a new phenomenon, right? We think this is just a cultural moment and it's brand new, but the truth is it's not. You've heard before when people talk about Jesus' life through the Gospels that they say, well, Jesus came to turn the world upside down. And I think that's a really fair statement. I've said that before, but honestly, I'm not really sure that that's what Jesus actually did. In fact, I think that Jesus came to put the world right side up, that he was pointing out that something had changed, that something was off, that something wasn't quite right. And when he came, he actually came to help us sort out reality from unreality. What Jesus decided to do was show up and say, look, you've been living in this world and it feels this way and you feel like it's normal, but guess what? It's like 20 degrees off of its axis and stuff's not quite right, and I have come to show you the way that life is supposed to be. That's why of all the things that Jesus could have come, of all the professions that he could have come as, coming as a rabbi was such a big deal. Think about this for a minute. Jesus came as a rabbi, a teacher, right? And the best definition for a rabbi or a teacher is an informational guide for developing mental maps to reality. It's a fancy way of saying Jesus came to show us what was real. Jesus came to give us a map, a pathway to understand what's real, what's true and not true. This is why Jesus referred to himself as the way and the truth and the life. So when you start asking yourselves questions, what's the best way to live? If you're a Jesus follower, Jesus made it very clear that he was going to give you the map to the best way to live. Now, the problem was when Jesus came, and began laying out these kingdom truths, these truths that were a reality, that this is the way God built the world, and this is the way the kingdom's supposed to look, and these are the way the relationships are supposed to be, and it was so different and so radically different than what people were experiencing in culture that they were uncomfortable about it. In fact, religious leaders who were supposed to be looking for God, who were supposed to be the tethers, right? That were holding culture where it needed to be, or holding the movement of God where it needed to be, like close and rooted and grounded in God, they had gotten off too. And so Jesus comes and says things like, well, love your neighbor, and that God loves everybody, and all these truths that he began kind of laying out. The religious leaders got so uncomfortable about it that they actually got to a place where they plotted his death. And spoiler alert, eventually they crucified Jesus. They had Jesus crucified by the Roman Empire. And Jesus was put to death for creating a mental map back to reality the way God saw things to be. Now, this is a sidebar, okay? This is not something that was normally planned to be a part of this message, but you got to think about this for a second. How much does Jesus confront our life? How often does what Jesus say and the truth that he lays out, how often does that confront your current preferred map to reality? The truth is, probably more often than we're willing to admit. This is no more prevalent and no more obvious than in Jesus' most famous sermon. I want to take just a few minutes to walk through one of Jesus' most famous sayings. And I want to show you that again, when Jesus said these words, there were people in the crowd that was like, how could he say this? How could he think this? No one could think this. And even today, 21st century America, we're going to hear these words and we're going to go, how can anybody think that? It doesn't even make any sense. But what we understand is Jesus is going, okay, you've been living in unreality. I want to bring you back to the truth of the way God created things. I want you to see things in a different way. This is what he says. This is in Luke chapter 6. It's not the most famous version of the Sermon on the Mount, but it's one of my favorites because of the way he ends it. And I want to share that with you kind of as we close out our time. The most famous recording of the Sermon on the Mount is actually found in the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew records the most detailed version of it. Luke just records pieces of it. All of the Gospel writers record pieces of this message because it's Jesus' most famous teaching. Matthew just has the most. But here's what Luke says that Jesus said when it came to how the world was really supposed to be. Check this out. Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. And right off the bat, you're like, wait, hold on a second. Poor, blessed? I've never thought that, right? Never really thought that this would be. It gets worse. He keeps going like this. Blessed are you who are hunger now, for you will be satisfied. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. And everybody in the crowd's like, they're beginning to cross their arms. Oh, whoa. Hold on a second. What are you saying? But he doesn't stop. He keeps going. Blessed are you when people hate you, when they exclude you and insult you and reject your name as evil because of the Son of Man. He refers to himself as a common term that people called him in that day. Blessed are you when someone rejects you because of me. That's what he's saying. And then, just to kind of twist the knife a little bit more, he says, rejoice in that day and leap for joy because great is your reward in heaven. For that is how their ancestors treated the prophets. So Jesus has just very quickly laid out some values for this new kingdom. We know that Jesus came to start a movement, and we're part of that movement today. We exist today as Jesus followers because of this original moment. And so this teaching has been central to the understanding of Christian theology for centuries and centuries and centuries. And so Jesus very quickly lays out some characteristics of how his kingdom works. But again, understanding this in the conversation we've been having about reality versus unreality, we want to understand what Jesus says is real. And this is what he says. In reality, right, you're blessed, and in our kingdom we value weakness. And in our kingdom we value sacrifice. And we value sorrow. And we value rejection. Now these are the values, these are the characteristics and the values of the kingdom that I've come to proclaim. This is what Jesus is saying to the crowd. Now, right off the bat, okay, and we're in church, so don't lie, right? And you can be honest with yourself between you and God, but like you look at this list, does this look attracting and appealing to you? In fact, you might be thinking to yourself, if this is what I'm getting into, this may not be what I want. And so then he flips it. He actually goes worse. It makes it even worse for us who are listening to this as 21st century readers. And he says this, but woe to you who are rich, for you've already received your comfort. Woe to you who are well fed now, for you will go hungry. Woe to you who laugh. Woe to you who laugh now, for you will mourn and weep. And woe to you whenever anyone speaks well of you, for that is how their ancestors treated the false prophets. So we got reality, right? We got reality where these four characteristics of the faith. And then he's about to lay out what's unreal, right? And what he says about unreality is this is woe, right? Woe to you. So he says all these things that we feel like are real, these things that we feel like are best, these characteristics that you're actually striving after, guess what? Those are lies. Those are unreal. Those are not things that are to be sought after. And he says the first one of those is power, right? This is one of those things you seek after. This is what the world says is good, is power. The second one is comfort, right? And the third one is success. And the fourth one is recognition. Now, again, let's just be honest, okay? Because I'm going to be honest with you too. You look at these two lists, and Jesus said, this is what my kingdom is all about, and this is what the world is all about, and I want you to have these things. If you're being honest with yourself, which one of these lists actually seems better to you? Right? I'm being honest, this list over here looks way better than this one. And in fact, it's crazy because these are the things we value in society. Right? These are the things we value. But here's the problem. Jesus knew that the way God had created the world, these things were a problem. And in the created order of things and the way that God wanted us to live our lives, these things were going to lead us to nothing but trouble. And you think to yourself, well, there's no way, right? Hold on, that doesn't make any sense. But think about this for a second. Think about what Jesus was actually laying out when he said this. Think about this first one for a second. Okay, let's think about weakness, right? Think about your relationships. Just for as an example in a relationship. Is it better in your relationship to power up or open up? Like if you're in a place where you're disagreeing with your spouse, you and your spouse are in active opposition on something, you're fighting, you're upset about something, is it better for you to just power up and go, now listen, you're going to do what I say? Or is it better for you to be meek and open and go, you know what? I'm going to be honest, I feel like I may have made a mistake here. And I feel like I might be wrong, and there's some things that I don't completely understand. And to show vulnerability that might lead you to a place of deeper connection. Which one of those things sounds better in your relationships? To power up or to open up? Yeah, to open up, right? What about sacrifice, right? Comfort. I think about this for parents just for a second. Think about this as parents. One of the things we do, and this is so hard for me as a parent because I struggle with this all the time, but one of the things we do for our kids is we say, well, you know what? We just want to protect our kids. We want to give them all the comforts, all the stuff we didn't have when we were kids, right? And we want to protect them and keep them in a bubble and keep them safe until we have to launch them in the world. And so we spend our entire parenting lives trying to prevent our kids from facing adversity or trying to face difficulty, get them as comfortable as possible. But the problem is, the character that you have and the work ethic that you have and the morals that you have because of the experiences you had and the adversity you faced in your past. So you know what happens when we keep our kids in a bubble and all we ever do is provide them comfort? They become entitled. They become arrogant. And when you launch them in the world, they become a sacrifice. Right? I mean, just be honest. It's a struggle because we don't want our kids to struggle. We want to provide as much comfort for them as we can, but we may actually be cutting their legs out from underneath of them. And Jesus said in our kingdom, like we understand this, that there's a hardship and the world is complicated. And so in this place, when you face adversity, as James says, you overcome that adversity and it brings maturity. What about the next one, right? Sorrow. You think to yourself, okay, Drew, you can do the others, but there's no way you can talk about sorrow. Do you know that sorrow is probably the best measure in the world of meaning? Isn't it? I mean, sorrow, when you're sad about something, when there's something you feel like you've lost, it's the best measure in your life of meaning. You know, I know so many people who have chased success and, all the things, right? They've sought after more zeros in their bank account and more toys in the garage and the bigger promotion and the bigger corner office and all the things. And you talk to them. And what you realize is you chase these carrots that are dangling on strings and you climb these ladders and in front of you and you get to the top and it's nothing that you thought it would be. And if you ask these people who got there, they look at you and they say, there's no meaning. It is completely void of meaning. And so Jesus is saying in our kingdom, we value sorrow because it means you understand and you have a value and a meaning and a purpose. One of the questions I ask every year when we do Be Rich is, what breaks your heart? Right? I'll tell you mine. I'll be completely honest. The thing that breaks my heart is at-risk kids. You put an at-risk kid in front of me or a kid that's going hungry or a kid that needs something and I will cave. This is what God breaks my heart about. And it's something He makes me passionate about. And I'll do everything in my power and everything that I possibly can to try to help those kids to be able to take steps into more meaningful life. That's what He wired me for. That's what breaks my heart. The reason we ask you this question is because God wires us all differently, and He gives us deep desires for meaning. And so what breaks your heart? What is it that when you see it in the world, you realize that's not right and it shouldn't be that way? Those moments of sorrow are deep measures of meaning. And then lastly, just this one real quick. I don't think I have to say this, but I'm going to anyway. Are we all really getting sick and tired of people who just do things to be recognized? I mean, I've watched my last TikTok of some person wearing a ridiculous costume and dancing around like a fool just so they can get views. Like I don't, isn't it exhausting, right? To watch people who are willing to just seek whatever's popular. There's no moral compass. There's just, I'll do whatever's popular or do whatever can get me recognition and whatever I can as soon as possible. Isn't that already all done? Like I feel like that's the reason we've got this new social media platform that's coming out. It's Be Real, I think is what it is, where like there's no filters, there's no way to stage it. It happens randomly. People just want to know what's real. And this search for authenticity, I'm afraid it's going to get hijacked because I don't think we're asking the right questions about what authenticity really is. I don't think we're having the right conversations. And I'll get there in a minute, and I'll tell you what we're going to do to kind of overcome that. But here's the problem. You look at these two lists, right? And Jesus said, this is the way my kingdom works. But this is what you've been steeped in for your whole life. And I want you to have these things, and this is what God built you to understand. But this is what you think you want. And you got to be asking the question, because I started asking the question when I looked at these two lists. How did we get here? How do we get here? How do we get to this cultural moment where the things that are so opposite of what God has built us to want and desire and to seek, those are the things that we want, right? We want the things that are so far removed from God's best for us. How did we get here? How did we get here? Well, I have a theory. And it's something we're going to unpack. It's going to take us 3 more weeks to get this unpacked. But I have a theory that it's because we've been kind of like frogs in the frying pan. And the heat's been slowly turned up. Slowly. And we're caught in a process. We're caught in a process that's been happening under our noses, and we haven't been paying attention because we haven't seen it. And Jesus hinted at this, right? He hinted at this when he spoke to the Pharisees about some problems that they were having. And so I want to share something that's found at the very end of the Gospel of this conversation about the Sermon on the Mount from the Gospel of Luke. This is what he says at the end. Listen to this. No good tree bears bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit. Each tree is recognized by its own fruit. People do not pick figs from thorn bushes or grapes from briars. Essentially, what you are, like what's happening on the inside, and you don't get an apple off an orange tree, right? And so your status, your faith, the person that you are, there's a level of authenticity that's eventually going to come out. You can't hide yourself forever. You can't pretend to be something you're not forever. And then he says this, a good person brings good things out of the good stored up in their heart, and an evil person brings evil things out of the evil stored up in their heart. And then he hammers it home with this. This is the theme verse for the rest of our time in this message series together. Out of the mouth, what comes out of the mouth is what's overflowing in the heart. So in other words, what's happening inside of you can only be hidden for so long. And the struggle is, when we say we want to follow Jesus, so we make this decision to follow Jesus, we don't always make the best decisions after that. And it's one thing to have faith, right? And it's one thing to just say, I'll believe, and I've decided to follow Jesus. But the problem is, so many times we don't surrender. We don't give the rest of our life over. We don't decide to make our, God's values our values. We don't decide to make God's character our character. We don't decide to be more Jesus-like every single day. And when we don't, we get caught in a pattern. And again, I said it just a minute ago, this is something that's been happening under your nose, and you don't even know what's happened. And as the heat is slowly turned up in your life and my life and in culture and everything that's happening around us, it's happening right under our noses, and we're not paying attention. Centuries ago, in the 15th century, one of the early church fathers, an early Christian mystic by the name of St. John of the Cross, and we'll talk a little bit more about him next week. He actually outlined 3 things that were making it difficult for us to continue to follow Jesus. That there were these enemies of the soul. And these enemies of the soul were actually combating our desire for faith. And they were rooting around, and there was this tug of war inside our hearts that was going on for our peace. And what he kind of says is that this is the pattern that's been existing for a long time, and the longer we've been in it, the less we see it. And it's pulling us in the opposite direction of where God wants us to be. And so you ask yourself the question, how on earth did we get to a place where God's values seem so far from what's normal to us? It's because, St. John of the Cross would say, because of these 3 things. And I don't have time to completely unpack them today. We're going to do that over the next few weeks, but I just want you to see this for a second, okay? So the first one he says is the devil. For our intents and purposes, and I'll explain this a little bit more later, we're going to talk about this with deceptive ideas, right? Because the devil's the father of lies, and he wants to plant lies, and he wants to use lies as his means to continue to carry out chaos in your life and my life and the rest of creation. And then there's the flesh. The flesh, that's our disordered desires. The things in us that something, when we make a decision to do something we know is not God's best for us, we did it because there was something inside of us that said that we'd be good. God says it's not, but something in us says it is. And then finally, the world, right? St. John of the Cross said, the devil, the flesh, and the world are the three enemies of the soul. And that really represents this sinful society. And I don't want you to take this too far or run too far down the ledge with this. All this really means is that other people are doing it, right? And so these behaviors that are just off center from what God would have us do, they're normalized by people around us because they're already doing them. So let me go back to the very first thing we said at the beginning of this message. We're in the world and we're feeling this tug of war between what God says is best for us and what we think is best for us, and it's just this back and forth and back and forth. We know, if you've been following Jesus long enough or just paying attention, right, we know something's not right. Something's not right. There's something off. And you look around our country, I don't want to dwell in this, but just think about this for a second. We're more divided now than we've ever been. And everybody's right. You go to the dinner and people are just so convinced that, well, this is, they're so convinced they're right and you're so convinced you're right. And there's this just like polarization that's happened. And we're more divided than we've ever been. And we're more, society's more complicated than it's ever been. And it's more like heated up than it's ever been. And there's just so much stuff that's happening, so much brokenness that seems to be on display. So many people who are convinced God hates them. So many scandals and messes in the church. So many messes that Christians are falling into every single day, and Jesus followers don't know what to do. And we sit back and we go, something's not right. We can't put our finger on it, but something feels off. And it's like the one-note song all over again, right? We know, you listen and you watch and you pay attention. You're like, there's something that's not quite lining up. But what is it? That's what we're going to talk about for the next 3 weeks. How do we break this process? How do we break this process of feeling that we're being pulled into a particular direction that's not God's best for us? But it's like there's nothing we can do about it. So I challenge you over the next few weeks, just open your eyes and pay attention and think. What's going on? And what's wrong? Let me pray for you. Heavenly Father, I just thank you so much for this time we've had together today. And I just pray that you would take these words and use them. Help us to understand the way you're working in the world. Help us to see you. And then ultimately, God, help us to know what you would have us do and give us the boldness and courage to do it. God, we love you so much. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.